I'm Rose McDermott. I'm the third part of the interdisciplinary aspect of this. I'm a political scientist and a very proud student of Bob Jervis. And this is a perfect bookend to what we were just hearing about in terms of pro-social aspects, because I'm going to, as a political scientist, talk about what we study, which is conflict, combat, all the violent, negative parts of this. This is work that I do with my graduate student, Anthony Lopez, who I shared with Leah Cosby, through both his advisors, and my other collaborator, Peter Tommy. So, Bob, does this work?
It's up and down.
Oh, like that?
I'm sorry.
Do I go on? Bob actually confirmed and reminded me that the origin of this project, and this is really going to be theoretical and conceptual more than data-driven, because we're just beginning the experiments to interrogate various aspects of this. But this project actually started when I was asked of all things to give a talk to Strategic Air Command. It was a very bizarre thing. It was like, 1,000 uniformed military officers and a guy who's carrying a nuclear football, standing there and really talking about the conceptual origins of revenge as a psychological motivation and undergirds deterrence as a policy. So that was the sort of origins of where this came from. And because at that time I was at Santa Barbara working with the Center for Evolutionary Psychology, it's the theoretical and explanation that we were looking at was very similar to what we just heard about with the pro-social side, but really looking at the ways in which, as a psychological mechanism, revenge can help undergird this process of deterrence, whereby you want to stop somebody else from hurting you. And so what you're really trying to do in that nexus of revenge and deterrence is to transfer these costs from the other person who's trying to impose on to you onto the people who are trying to hurt you. And as a recurring challenge, this is something that we should have as humans, adaptive mechanisms that have evolved. And what's really interesting in the origins of this is when I was looking at this, and I was thinking about this during the earlier presentation about the chimps, is that there's really wonderful ways in which Richard Wright has some work on monkeys that looks at how they engage in combat and surveillance, almost identical to the way that American Special Forces teach our soldiers how to engage in border patrol and surveillance and incursion and all those kinds of things as well. And so I do think that there's really good non-human evidence in support of the notion of trying to transfer and impose the fitness costs that other people are trying to impose onto you onto the other side. So what we really were trying to do is look at how to distinguish negative reciprocity from revenge. And there's been a lot of work in behavioral economics on negative reciprocity, and in particular the work that Ernest Fear has done looking at punishment. And the point that Tori was making earlier about, do people cooperate just because of punishment, or are there other things such as informational costs or normative implications that lead to people engaging in negative reciprocity? And so the idea is that often in the literature, especially in the literature of political science, these notions get completely conflated. And they're talked about interchangeably, as though revenge is really the thing that motivates the need for punishment, and that punishment is inextricably indistinguishable from processes of revenge. And I think of them as quite different domain-specific motivations. And the reason that I think this is important in a political context is that oftentimes when we're, say, negotiating with terrorists, right, because that's the whole thing, you're not supposed to negotiate with terrorists, that there's oftentimes that we are treating these tractable adversaries who we could negotiate with as though they were implacable enemies, precisely because of this conflation between negative reciprocity and revenge. What I mean by that is when we have situations where somebody could be negotiated with, because we actually treat the psychological motivation for it as driven in revenge and is driven in anger, it can be quite difficult to separate that out and decide who you can negotiate with and achieve the outcome you want to achieve in a way that's acceptable to both of you, versus a situation where actually they're a true believer. They'd rather kill themselves, they'd rather kill you than have a particular kind of political outcome. So what we tried to do, before I get to this, the retaliatory spectrums we developed, when we were looking at the sort of triggers of revenge, none of this will surprise any of you, but so many of them are emotional in nature. Right? There are things like shame, humiliation, withholding benefits, withholding resources, but importantly, a lot of them really have to do with status reversal, right? Making someone feel like they're less than you, somehow denigrating them, and that often triggers these desires for revenge. We've also seen some things related to like the cartoons that were done in Belgium and religious offenses, but in many cases, the motivations that trigger these psychological responses are emotional in nature. Oops. So this is actually what I wanted to spend some time talking about. In our attempt to separate out negative reciprocity from revenge, we were trying to do it along a number of different dimensions. And one of them was, what is the magnitude of response that's going to happen when somebody engages in these disproportionate things? And here with negative reciprocity, I'm really thinking more of these tit-for-tat things along the lines of the behavioral economics games that we've seen done with dictator games and other sort of things. So with negative reciprocity, you would expect a proportionate response. So you think about like the cyber attack that just may or may not have been instigated by North Korea, and you have Obama coming out and saying, okay, they did this to us, and so they attacked so many, and so we're going to shut them down in a denial of service for 24 hours, and that's a sort of proportionate response. Whereas a disproportionate response would be something where somebody, manages an attack against you in a very limited way, and then you might go to an all-out war immediately in response. One of the things that we're trying to distinguish is also the emotional triggers that undergird and instigate the difference between these things. And we're positing at the moment, and this is one of the experimental tests we're actually engaging in now, is looking at the difference between anger and hatred and how that may instigate these different kinds of responses. Part of this actually comes from some experimental work that Erin Halpern has done in Israel, looking at mood manipulation with anger and revenge, and then examining support for the peace process in Israel. And what he finds is that people who actually have hatred are much less likely to show support for the peace process than people who are just angry as a result of having received having received rocket attacks. So he looks at people who live in areas that have sustained rocket attacks versus people who have been in areas that haven't sustained rocket attacks. Looked at how mood effects then show support for these political outcomes, and so that's where the theoretical motivation for that comes from. The function of negative reciprocity is really to recalibrate the enemy's preferences, to say it's not worth the cost to you to engage in this thing, and in return, if you stop doing it, then we'll stop hurting you in a response, and then you can recalibrate their preferences. Whereas what's happening with revenge is you really want to annihilate it. You're really looking for a kind of extermination. You can think about this, Steve Pinker talks about it a lot in Better Angels of Our Nature, where the ancestral version of revenge and retaliation was essentially annihilation. You go in and you get rid of the entire enemy so that they're not physically capable of retaliating against you and engaging in these kind of half-healing coy spirals of hostility. The work that we've done less on in terms of beginning to examine the experimental specifications that have to do with speed and probability of counter-retaliation, but we're positing them. We'll test them later after we get through the beginning part of it. The notion here with speed is with negative reciprocity, the response is immediate, whereas revenge is delayed. You can think about that as the difference between hot and cold level, versus, like hot anger versus cold, calibrated, calculated, premeditated. I'm going to sit around and make sure you hurt, and I'm going to figure out all the ways in which I can make you hurt the most in a very cold, calculated way, versus crimes of passion. You find somebody who's hurt your child or something, you're going to immediately respond to them. And the probability of counter-retaliation, of course, derives out of that, such that if the response has been proportionate, you may or may not get a counter-retaliation, whereas if somebody's actually seeking to kill you, your probability of response and also the extremity of your response is going to be higher. So again, we're trying to do some experimental tests of some of this, but this is the theoretical orientation that we're working with. I should go back and say that part of this is motivated by the notion that, when I was having these conversations with Lita, and she was saying, motivation is really under-theorized, we were agreeing, I was really thinking about the domains, and as a domain-specific mechanism, to think about the domains where revenge and conflict might exist as independent mechanisms that would contribute to cooperation. Right? So the ways in which, as a conflictual group, you need to be able to cooperate with your in-group in order to be able to engage in conflict more effectively with the out-group. And that's the link between the two of them. And so, because I'm a political scientist, I have to think about how it relates to policy outcomes. And it goes back to this issue of mistaking negative reciprocity for revenge, and thus triggering unduly disproportionate responses. And there's another political scientist at NYU who is also sort of involved early on in some of my dissertation work, Bruce Mosquita. And he actually has a very interesting phrase where he talks about the difference between, in terrorists, between relatively reasonable terrorists and true believers. And it seems odd to think about relatively reasonable terrorists, but these are basically people that have real political goals. And those goals may be territorial, those goals may be political, they may be related to the fact that the state is repressing you in some way that makes it very difficult for you to accomplish particular kind of social goals. And that if you actually gave those people some of what they want, they would stop engaging in the violence. Whereas a true believer, there's nothing you can actually give them because what they want is the violence, right? They want the death. They want whatever outcomes they think come out of the death. And he talks about how one of the ways you can separate out in real world terms, the difference between this, for example, whether or not the terrorist group has a political wing. So you think about the IRA always had a political wing, and Sinn Féin, they had very clear political goals. Some of those political goals were kind of crazy. We want a completely Marxist, fascist society. Well, those things don't usually go together, but you could imagine that you could have some negotiations with them. Versus a group like ISIS, like who do you even negotiate with? There's not even a hierarchical structure that you could begin to have a conversation with. And the problem is that if you treat the IRA as though they're ISIS, you create an enemy you don't have to create, right? Where peace is possible, you actually create an enemy by hijacking this revenge motivational system for an instance where you could actually have cooperation. Right? So that's the difficulty in that regard in terms of escalating spirals of violence. But it can work the other way as well, where if you treat somebody who is a true believer as though they were a relatively reasonable terrorist, you can end up getting yourself killed. So you can understand that the threat of miscalibrating and misassessing is actually asymmetric as well. So there's been quite an important series of work done by Tom Schoen early on in the RAND Corporation, where he talked about the power, the rationality, irrationality, and miscommunicating back and forth to each other about what you're going to do and what your intentions are. And the reason I think it's relevant here is that that's part of what makes it difficult to make correct attributions about which type you're playing, right? Is because each actor has an incentive to misrepresent his type so that he can get more of what he or she wants. Right? And then again, here I think the other system that can get mishijacked is the one around the power of self-deception. And here I'm thinking in particular of Bob Trimmer's work, not only on overconfidence but also on behavioral leakage, and how when you are much more likely to be able to recruit labor for combat if you don't have behavioral leakage, right? If you go out and you say, I'm going to fight and I'm going to win, everybody's going to join in. If you're like, well, I'm going to do this fight and, it might be kind of okay and maybe we'll win and maybe we'll lose and you want to go on, You know, you're not going to recruit labor successfully, right? So the only way you're going to recruit labor successfully, and remember before we cross the militarized threshold, the best predictor of winning in combat is size and surprise, right? So size is a really key part. It has to be big enough to win, but not so big you can't keep the group together, which is the cooperative part of in-group behavior. Motivated, I believe, by the desire for conflict, effective conflict. So you don't want the behavior leakage. You're much more likely to recruit labor if you believe your own lies, right? But again, if you believe your own lies, then the other guy's going to believe your lies too, right? So it can, again, make it very difficult to calibrate exactly who your enemy is. So I think that part of the reason that revenge as a psychological mechanism has served effectively over evolutionary time in humans is that you can produce effective deterrence. And in political science, one of my concerns is I feel like deterrence is always talked about in the nuclear realm. Like there's no notion that there's deterrence that is anything short of nuclear weapons. And in fact, I think that the psychological mechanism for revenge that undergirds deterrence is way, way older than the evolution of nuclear weapons, right? And so that the revenge evolved to create more effective deterrence, and that we can, you know, have nuclear weapons sit on that platform. But it's only through this reputation for disproportionate response that we end up not having to fight battles that we would have otherwise had to fight, right? If you have a reputation, don't attack me because I'm going to kick your ass, right? You're not going to attack me. It means there's going to be some small proportion of fights that I'm going to win without having to fight. And that's a huge evolutionary advantage, right? So that's going to reinforce, and in some populations almost move to fixation, right? You can see it in pastoralist societies and other societies where through honor killings and so on, people put heavy stakes. They'll kill their kin in order to sustain their reputation for resolve and revenge. Because it has this particular ability to convey important information about the cost that you'll pay in order to sustain that reputation. So you may purchase safety, but it's going to come at this incredible cost. Okay. So I think that there are failures of deterrence, and that these are the greatest threats about the link between revenge and deterrence. In the modern world, in the state system, there are very, very few places where there aren't states, and so it can be very difficult to find terrorist groups that can sort of run away, like in an ancient kind of run and hide, or what we see in chimpanzee societies in Africa sometimes. And the issue of rogue states. And so these are challenges to the modern notions of deterrence that may or may not have been relevant in the ancestral environment where revenge would have developed as a psychological mechanism designed to enhance deterrence. The other issue that we always have to deal with in political science is, as Bob mentioned earlier, is this levels of analysis problem and whether or not group behaviors really transfer into state-level behaviors, mostly for all the organizational and institutional issues that Bob so carefully and saliently raised. But I think that in this particular domain of revenge, it's not just an issue of leaders, although they're key, but also the different signals that are being sent to different aspects of the group, right? So it's not just that one group, through processes of revenge, is treating the other group or the other individual badly because you want them to behave a certain way, but you're also sending signals to third-party observers about how you will behave if they betray you or engage in other kinds of bad behavior toward you. And it can be very difficult to know if the true intender of an act is the person you're actually directing it to or these third-party observers who may not attack directly because they're much more formidable. Okay. And the last thing that I just wanted to mention is that I don't think that revenge is just a domain-specific thing related to conflict in the domain of combat. And the next area we want to explore is whether or not this generalizes to other domains, especially related to mate selection and processes of jealousy and revenge in the sexual and reproductive domain. And I'm out of time, so I'll stop there, and thank you very much.